We're going to wrap up our discussion of federalism today, okay? And it's pretty light stuff. But when we left off, I don't know if I got to this page yesterday or not. Don't write all this down. But you might write down what a federal mandate is, okay? What a federal mandate is it's a directive, all right, saying to the states or local communities they have to do something. Sometimes they send money for that. Sometimes they don't. That would be called an unfunded mandate. And states just love those, okay? Now, typically, what the federal government do, if they're going to send a mandate out, they're going to give you a choice. You can solve this problem yourself, or we can do it for you. Generally, states don't like the federal government, coming in and, telling them what to do. So they generally say, oh, we'll handle it ourselves, our way. Okay? Let me give you a couple examples of this. And like I said, you don't need to write all this down. But the Asbestos Hazard Act of 1986. You guys know what asbestos is?
Yes.
No, it's stuff they use for insulation. No. It's insulation. Okay? And they used it in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. Even before that, 50s. This school was built in what, 1964? Okay? So there's a lot of asbestos in this school. And there was asbestos in schools all over the country. And what they figured out is if you disturb it and the particles escape from it and you breathe those in, it can cause lung cancer, especially in young people's lungs that are still developing. Yeah, so in 1986, they said, we need to clean this up to protect students. Okay, and over spring break, over the last many years, they'll say nobody in the school. No teachers, no students, nobody in the school. Because they're removing asbestos from the school. And they've been doing that for years. Okay, we still have some. Quite a bit, actually. In the auditorium, in the ceiling, that's asbestos. The commons. The ceiling of the cave. You don't want to breathe that. You don't want to breathe that stuff in, okay?
Okay, so it's in the commons, you don't breathe.
No, you don't disturb it, and you're fine.
Wait, they've had how long to remove this? 40 years? 30 years? 30 years. They've had 30 years to do this?
And they have removed it in many places.
Why not here?
Many places around the school they Dude, were you listening?
Why haven't they removed it all yet?
Yeah, I feel like,
They got the whole summer.
maybe like one fell swoop is good, like,
Okay.
I don't get like gradual.
They might have to take down
I mean,
the
I get
whole
like a
ceiling.
side-
Yeah, you would have to basically destroy the school and rebuild it. To do it all at once. Hey, don't complain to me. I'm just the messenger. Okay? Now, the Federal Clean Air Act of 1970 gave states, goals to reach. Now in the 70s, guys, smog was a pretty big problem in our major cities. There are still cities today you don't really want to breathe in, especially during the summertime. Go to a city like Houston, where there's a lot of humidity and not as much wind as we have here. And so the pollution just sits, okay? And it's heavy air, so it sits in that air. And you breathe that in, you get higher, cases of childhood asthma and health problems and so forth, kind of like the Dust Bowl. So Clean Air Act of 1970, states were given money to reach certain goals. All right, and we've done a pretty good job with this. In the summertime, it can get pretty bad. Or on a day like today in Kansas, where we haven't had rain for weeks, and then the wind's blowing like this, it's probably not healthy air to breathe outside. I'm pretty sure it's not. Okay, so in the summertime, when you fill up your car with gasoline, okay, they tell you to fill it up in the morning before it gets too hot, or in the evening as it cools down. Because when the heat mixes with that gasoline, it evaporates, and then it puts chemicals into the air, and it's not good for the environment. Okay, so you do that in the morning time when it's not super hot. Okay. I do. I try. Yeah, actually.
I didn't know that.
I don't really call myself a tree hugger, but I mean, if I can do that, I'm still going to mow my grass with a, Briggs and Stratton mower, an engine, but yeah, still going to drive a V8.
With scissors.
Please, just an aside.
Okay, now this one, guys, as I was mentioning yesterday, hey, listen, we don't have to make comments over everything I talk about, okay? In 1986, the carrot and the stick, right? This is what the federal government did. They said, we have this money for you for transportation, but in order for you to get this money, we think it's best that we change the drinking age to 21. But that's a state law. It's not a federal law. So the federal government basically blackmailed the states into changing their drinking age. Okay, this was in 1986 when I was 17 years old. Okay. My sister was 19, and anybody that was already 18 got grandfathered in. Okay, so it changed. Now Louisiana did hold out.
I think, wait a minute.
What?
I think that Kansas was already 21.
I didn't live in Kansas.
Yeah.
I lived in Florida.
Yeah.
Orland.
Yeah, but if this didn't happen to those
Now,
You can live in all.
down in Nolens and Louisiana, they thought they could get more tourism if they kept theirs at 18.
They could have.
Okay? Well, they did get a lot of tourism, but they got no transportation money from the federal government.
And they're busted.
Now, if you remember that part of the Constitution where it says you can't treat different states differently, you know what I mean? You can't favor one state over another. I'm pretty sure this is kind of unconstitutional to withhold transportation funding from Louisiana, but they did.
You read a streetcar named Desire? They have good transportation already. But
You haven't driven in Louisiana recently, have you?
actually, I have.
And their roads aren't very good.
No, it's not.
No. Kansas has among the top roads in the country. I don't know if you knew that.
Yeah, we spend a bunch of time on it. One time.
One of the top five.
You can tell there's when you drive into Missouri. Like the road is instantly.
Oklahoma,
so
too.
by the density of Oklahoma.
How many more decades until the Kellogg project is done?
Yeah, the federal
We're only looking about 200 decades.
All right, guys, this is a little bit dated, 2004, and I've tried to find one, like this for more recent, but I haven't been able to. But this shows the amount of money that states have to come up with to pay for unfunded mandates. So these are costs that the federal government says you need to do this. We're not going to give you any money. So states like Mississippi and South Carolina, almost 7 to 9% of their budget is already tied up in these unfunded mandates. For Kansas back in 2004, it was between 3 and 5%. So in addition to the federal government telling states, if you want this money, you have to match a certain amount of it. That's controlling our budget. Then the unfunded mandates are controlling our budget. And 34% of all spending Kansas does comes from the federal government. That is a lot of control over the states. Okay? This is not something we had prior to the 1970s.
One might call that unconstitutional.
You might call it a unitary system of government rather than a federal system of government. That's where we're heading. Okay? Now, you don't have to write all this down. But as you guys are well aware, I've been railing against the federal government for a day and a half now. There are some positives to federal authority over the states. Okay? Yep, there is. Can you imagine if states came up with their own environmental codes when it came to pollution?
Wouldn't that be great?
It'd be great. So Kansas could just say, you know what? You can pollute all you want. Move your industries here. We'll have all the jobs we want. Everybody will be employed. It'll be great.
So we have one state park?
But then all that pollution,
45.
on a day like today is going to blow into Nebraska. Okay. Now, industries like to build near water sources, right? You need water to build things, to manufacture. Okay. So the Mississippi River is a good example of that. If Mississippi changed their environmental codes and people polluted in the water, well, that would affect other communities around the country. Okay, so it's important that we have kind of a standardized umbrella on certain things when it comes to the environment. Remember when I told you a story about my parents wanting to build a dock into the bay? Now that kind of crap ticks me off. You know what I mean? But this makes sense. Okay, kind of having that umbrella of kind of environmental codes. Now, Kansas and other states can try and attract businesses to their states through the tax code, like having lower corporate taxes or doing away with property taxes for businesses for an amount of time to build a factory here. If Cessna wanted to expand, we could say to Cessna, okay, you're going to expand, build a new factory. We won't charge you any property taxes for 10 years. Okay? But all those new jobs that are created, all those people are going to be taxpayers. And so that's going to rejuvenate, the tax revenue. So states do this. Communities do this. For instance, Hartford, Connecticut is known as the insurance capital of the world. Many major insurers are based in Hartford. Okay? And the reason why is because they give them a good tax deal. And so insurance companies move there. You can do that as a state. Okay? The other one that is so important to the central authority of the federal government is when it comes to your rights. The 14th Amendment defines who a citizen is and says everyone has equal protection under the law. Well, the federal government, the Attorney General, the federal courts ensure that you are not mistreated in Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia. Okay? Or in the case of the baker from Colorado that didn't want to build a cake for a gay wedding because of his religious beliefs. Okay? The federal courts were going to find out whether they're going to protect his First Amendment right to free exercise of religion. That's the umbrella. So the state of Colorado is not upholding his right to freedom of religion. Okay, so the federal government can come in and say, Colorado, you can't take away this man's freedom of religion. We'll see what they do. Okay, that's coming down the pike. All right, you guys following me on that? So there's some really positive aspects of this. I mean, going back to Jim Crow laws and mistreatment of individuals based on their race and so forth, guys, you have constitutional rights and the federal government will protect those. Okay, hopefully. And that's important. Yes? Okay. Here's another important factor of federalism, okay, is that states can encourage alternate solutions to problems. And this goes back to what we talked about with the Catholic Church and subsidiarity, okay, where you solve the problem where it exists by people that live there, okay? And states can be laboratories of democracy. What can be laboratories of democracy? Did I mention that states could be laboratories of democracy? You might want to write that down. So, guys, there is a lot of talent at the state and local level. People that care, people that want to solve problems. Like I talked about yesterday, we talked about feeding school children whose parents can't afford to feed them lunch and breakfast. Okay, so can the community do something about that? Can we solve this problem at a state or local level without federal involvement? And the answer is yes. Okay, now, back in the 1990s, President Clinton, there were two new governors, one from Wisconsin and one from Michigan. Okay, and President Clinton gave them the go-ahead to try and solve the problem of welfare dependency in their states. So they came up with some new programs they thought would get people off of welfare and put them to work. See, guys, by the early 90s, you had generations of people, like 4 generations of people that were on welfare. You had, in, say, 1965, you get this 15-year-old girl that gets pregnant. She doesn't get married. She has a kid. She can't raise the kid. She doesn't have the money. So she goes on welfare. The kid's on welfare. The kid grows up, and that kid has a child out of welfare, out of marriage, okay? And they go on welfare. And then it repeats it again. 4 generations of people that are dependent on somebody else for their subsistence. This is no good for anybody. It's the new plantation, where slaves relied on their masters for their subsistence. Now we have people on welfare that have been on it their whole lives.
They're not doing any work, so they're not slaves.
But they're subservient to somebody else.
They're more like the Native Americans. So we totally screwed them over and then threw them on reservations, and now they're all economically reliant on welfare.
And casinos.
And casinos.
Yes. So, these 2 governors came up with plans, and they started to work. And to President Clinton's credit, Democratic president with a new Republican Congress, run by the new Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, proposed this plan that was used in Michigan and Wisconsin to reform welfare in the United States. And that's when they started putting the work requirement. In order to get welfare, you either had to be going to school or working to get welfare. And I read this morning in the news that some states are considering, in order to get Medicaid, health insurance for the poor, you have to be working or going to school. Okay? It's kind of that tough love approach, okay, to governing. Not just saying, here's a free handout. It's saying you have to work to get this. You have to do something to improve your lot in life. Okay? And that worked, man. There were people freaking out that, children were going to starve to death. The homelessness was going to, quadruple because people couldn't get their welfare checks. It didn't happen. Millions of people went from welfare to work. But that doesn't happen without these laboratories of democracy, where people can try different things at the local level and the state level to solve problems. If we go to this cookie-cutter approach from a unitary system in Washington, D.C., where they hand down the same program for everybody, okay, you don't get that ingenuity. You don't allow local and state talent to work. People that really are closer to the problem. Okay? And so, guys, as we kind of start wrapping this up, this is that tug-of-war between the federal and the state. And it's been going on since the country started. Okay? The Civil War. The southern states said, we want to make our own decision when it comes to owning slaves. And the North said, this needs to go. This needs to stop. And they said, no, we're going to keep it. And they said, no, you're not. And so they said, okay, fine, we're leaving. We're leaving the Union. And they said, no, you can't do that. And they said, well, make us stay. And so they did. Right? I mean, what is essentially, obviously slavery is the gorilla in the room, but the underlying factor here is federalism. Who gets to make the decision? Okay? Now, the North was right. Okay? And they won. And we got rid of this institution. Okay? So, but it's still, it's that debate. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean every time a state says, hey, states' rights, that they're wrong. Does it? Because of the Civil War? No, of course not. Okay? That's what somebody that's uneducated would say. But you're not uneducated. Okay. The 10th Amendment. Okay, the 10th Amendment. I can almost guarantee you that's going to be one of the amendments on your test. Reserved powers. Okay? Powers that are not given to the national government are reserved to the state and local governments. Okay? Unless they say the states can't do it. Okay? Federalism is an additional check on the constitutional framework. One of the things states can do is if Congress proposes an amendment that the states don't like, the states don't have to ratify it. That's a check on the federal government. As is the Convention of the States that Mr. Ebright is in such support of, okay, where the states can propose amendments on their own without the help of Congress. Okay? So it's an additional check on the federal government, as Alexander Hamilton called it. Okay? More decisions to be made at the local level, and these are things generally we do at the local level. Okay? Public education, fire protection, car registration, road construction, libraries. Okay? These are policies that affect our daily lives. It involves more people in the decision-making process, not fewer. Okay? Yeah?
Can you describe the 10th Amendment, like, dumb it down more? I don't know what reserve power is.
Okay, so we'll go with education, public education. So nowhere in the Constitution are the words public education mentioned. So it's not a power given to the national government. And nowhere in here does it say that the states can't do education. It's not mentioned. So that power to run public education is left or reserved to the states or to the people, which is local government. So who should run public schools? State and local government. Okay? I just got this thing, this email from the state for state assessment tests for social studies that we're going to be giving to the juniors. And we have to grade them. We, like the teachers, have to grade them. Okay? And there's 22 pages of guidelines on how to grade and submit these things. The writing portion. We're grading the writing portion in-house. You guys remember Mrs. Rao?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You know, she's staying home with her kids. So we came up with a great idea as a department. We'll just take all the sub-pay that we would get, because we're going to have to take 2 full days, the whole department, to grade these. Okay. 300 essays. Just taking all that sub-pay and giving it to Mrs. Rao and have her grade all for you. I haven't received a reply yet from that text. Oh, it's on my phone. I'll check later. It said, hey,
How much money would it be?
probably about $1,000.
I'll
I'll do it.
I'll grade 300 essays for 1,000.
Yeah.
I'd gladly chip in a little bit more, actually. Okay. All right.
I'll do it for 1,200.
So here's your tug of
Hey, are
war.
we taking bids on the job?
Why'd you go up and down, not up?
He's gonna hold 44 hours.
Yeah. Okay. So, guys, this debate, this tug of war continues. Now, there's one example I want to share with you that I was pretty passionate about, and you can ask your parents about this, okay? A lot of your parents are about the same age as me. Some might be a little younger, some might be a little older. So some of your parents were probably impacted by the change in the drinking age. You can ask them, how old were you when they changed the drinking age? Ask your parents that, okay? Parents just love to talk about what they did when they were in high school and college, right? To tell their kids about, right? I dread those questions from my kids, okay?
What did you do?
Yeah, that didn't stop you from drinking. did it?
Well, so let me give you an example. When they changed the drinking age, I mean, guys, you guys grow up in a far different world than we do. I've talked to some of your parents, not specifically your parents, but parents of Bishop Carroll students that went to school here. And the stuff they did, there's no way you would get away with that today.
Exactly.
I mean, you guys have been hosed, really, as far as...
Cameras everywhere.
But also, it's kind of protected you from doing something really stupid. You know what I mean?
Like White House stupid?
Well, that's kind of different. I mean, that's more of a modern thing with social media and stuff, right? But did people get in fights, maybe sometimes using a baseball bat back then? Of course they did, okay? But the social media thing's totally different, okay? But everything's is different. I mean, when I was in high school, this is what we used to do on weekends. I went to Escambia High School, and on a Friday night, you would see 50, 60 cars of high school kids in the Winn-Dixie parking lot, okay, like the Dillon's parking lot. And people would just come in there, and people would be drinking beer, hanging out for a couple of hours before the cops would show up. I mean, we're talking like 50 or 60 cars with like 100 kids just hanging out drinking beer in the parking lot. And the cops would come by and say, hey, you guys need to leave. And so everybody would go somewhere else, like to the Magic Market, which is like the Quick Trip, and hang out at the Quick Trip. Okay, drinking beer. I mean, it really, the cops were like pretty lenient about it, Sometimes they make you pour it out and stuff, but a lot of times they wouldn't. So they just say, you guys need to leave, okay? This is totally different. Now, in the 1970s, we had an energy crisis. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, put an embargo on the United States. Stop selling oil to the United States.
Why is that?
Because of our Middle East policy and our relationship with Israel. And basically, guys, we had a shortage of fuel in this country. So there were like long lines at gas stations. And gas stations would run out of gas. And gas prices went way up. And so the government, in all of its wisdom, said, you know what, we need to conserve energy. And they figured out through a study that driving on the highway, you would be most fuel efficient driving at 55 miles an hour. So they told the states, if you want money for transportation, here's the carrot and the stick again. If you want money for transportation, you will change your speed limit on your highways to 55 miles an hour. I'm sorry?
Yeah, what was it like? No speed limits up to the 100?
They were in the 70s. In the night prior to this, there were speed limits 70, 75 miles an hour. Like it is today.
Like
Okay.
96, on 96
Now-
you can get up 70.
You can go 75 on the interstate. But hey, listen. Have any of you guys driven like to Colorado or anything like that recently? Can you imagine driving at 55? Guys, I don't think you understand. It was brutal. Ask your parents about this. Driving 55 straight up was horrible. Horrible. It would, driving to Colorado at 55 instead of 80,
75.
85. Okay, it's 75 on I-70, right?
You go 85.
I'll do 83.
There you go.
Okay.
83.
So
He
83,
goes up to 85.
83,
that federal-
55. Okay? Horrible. I don't think you understand. Okay, this is like, I'm like Sam Adams right here. This is driving me crazy. Okay?
Is that fun?
Huh?
Is that what that Sammy Hagar song's about?
Yes, I can't drive 55. And I'm going to play the video for you at the end of class.
Oh my
Okay?
God.
And it's awesome. Okay? Coach, I was just telling these guys about driving 55 miles an hour. That was 55, Coach.
That's 1963, or 73.
Yeah, Jimmy Carter.
Now, the speed limit was this way. If the states didn't comply, they wouldn't get any federal money.
Coach knows. Was it bad driving 55?
They said it saved gas money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Kansas is kind of different than like Rhode Island, right? Montana's a little bit
The
different.
Rhode Island Rams, number 25 in the nation. And Wyoming, there is no speed. There is no speed limit. You make it miles an hour because it's open area.
Whoa. I'm driving to Wyoming this summer.
I was in Montana when they raised it to 80. And the dangerous part is when somebody's going 50 and you're going 80, you don't realize how fast you're coming up on somebody. It's not the driving 80 that's so dangerous. It's that. The slowing down when somebody's in front of you. That's where things can get pretty hairy. I noticed that when I was out there.
I understand why that 55 thing came about, the embargo, the oil embargo. We used to own all the oil companies, all the oil. We drilled the first oil well in Saudi Arabia, places like that. And because of the Shah and some of the other things and some of the people who were ruled, we fell on bad times with them, so they tried to punish us and everything. Okay, so eventually he'll tell you that, you talk about this oil thing, we don't want to lose the Suez Canal.
Right.
Okay, because then you won't be able to get that stuff out.
Yeah. But the United States
You take what is it? Do we import how much oil?
Well, I was just going to say, Coach, they said yesterday on the news that the United States has become the #1 producer of oil in the world, which is good for national security, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
The other thing they're going to do with that oil, they're going to convert that to natural gas. Anything else you want to know?
Better than
Global warming.
It is better.
better than ethanol.
Global warming's real.
But during those times too, in 1973, the interest rate was 14%.
My parents bought a house in '76, paying 13.5% on a $100,000 loan. Nearly bankrupt my mom and dad.
Oh my goodness.
14%, 13%.
Jimmy Carter, peanut farmer.
That's right. Now, he was in good shape. He was in good shape because what he produced, the peanut, every time he put a peanut in the ground, it grew. He had a guaranteed market. You didn't have that here in western Kansas or eastern Kansas with soybeans or wheat or corn or anything else.
Yep.
I'm sorry, excuse me.
Did you need anything? Or is this for me?
Yeah. Sorry to bother you.
Is this a gift? Do I have to get out the pliers for this, Coach?
He's just kidding.
Seal.
Keep your eyes open.
You can put his glasses on.
All right, so in 1996, I remember, okay, I was living in Kansas by then, and I was working as a para at Mays High School, and I would take K96 out to Mays High School, which is now Mays Middle School.
You were a paralegal?
No, a paraprofessional, which paid less than minimum wage, but I wanted to get into the classroom as soon as possible when I was going to school at Wichita State. So I became a para, and I actually got to teach a little bit as a para, which was good experience for me. But anyhow, I'm on my way on K96 out there. Speed limit's 55. But this particular day, when I was driving out there, the Republicans had taken over both houses of Congress, and they said, you know what, Kansas is different than Rhode Island. And Kansas should determine what their speed limits are, not the federal government. And so, that morning, the workers were out there changing the sign from 55 to 65. That stretch of road now is 70. And I remember honking my horn and yelling out the window, yeah! Federalism! I didn't yell federalism, but I yelled and I honked my horn. I was like, yeah! 65! Woo!
What the workers do?
They were like, I was going pretty fast. But no, that was a great day for America. The states won a battle in the tug of war, okay? And to me, that's important. And I think, when you guys leave here and you graduate in a couple months, are you going to forget what federalism is? Are you going to remember that the founders of this country felt like the states had a role to play in all this? Okay? So these ideas of a popular vote instead of the Electoral College, doing away with the 16th and 17th Amendments,
Get rid of them.
all bad ideas. Okay?
Doing away with the 16th and 17th Amendment is a bad idea?
No, instituting them were bad ideas.
You said doing away with them.
Okay, yeah.
Oh,
You know what I meant, right?
Yeah.
Am I wasting my breath right now responding to that?
No, I'm just trying to clarify
Yes, okay.
for the audience
Okay.
online.
Yes. They know. They've been watching. Okay. And that's going to sum this up. I'm not going to put the Sammy Hagar video on this video, but you can look it up on YouTube while you're looking at this.
Be sure to comment, like, comment, and subscribe. Like, comment,
Like, comment,
and subscribe.
and subscribe.